Welcome to the Fight Lawyer Podcast, where we discuss combat sports and the law. Our guest today is attorney Paul Edelstein, whose firm's $22 million partial settlement on behalf of boxer Magomed Abdusalamov changed boxing. Paul, thanks so much for taking the time to do this.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with, let's be honest, the reason why you're here, the reason why you're in most places. How did Magomed Abdusalamov walk into your life?
Mago was injured very severely in a boxing match in November 2013. The way he walked into my life is really sad because nobody walks into my life as a professional, as an attorney, in good circumstances. It's almost exclusively or always after something bad has happened to them, and in Mago's case, something tragic. His family sought me out because they were advised by people that they were trying to get help from, mostly physicians, that not only were they not able to be helped because of his condition, in other words, there were no doctors that really could do that much more than had been done for him at St. Luke's, but that very likely what happened to him was malpractice, and really they should seek out the help of an attorney rather than a doctor. So it's kind of a sad set of circumstances that brought him to my office.
Your client, he came to fight at MSG. How did he get there that night? Was he brought over from Russia? Did he fight here in the past? Or was he primarily an overseas fighter prior to the injury in MSG?
It's kind of all of those things. He was undefeated at the time of the fight at Madison Square Garden with Mike Perez. He was 18-0 as a professional. Most of the fights had taken place overseas. He's originally from Dagestan. But he had been living and training at the time of the fight in Madison Square Garden in Hollywood, Florida. He had also lived for a short period of time and fought in California and Los Angeles before coming to New York for this fight. And this fight was really a precursor, sort of one or two fights away from him having a really big title shot or a shot at a bigger money fight, because Mike Perez and him at the time were both contenders, both highly ranked. So this was sort of the highlights, I guess, for him at that point. It was the topmost fight that he had gotten. So that's how he came to New York at the time. He wasn't living in New York at the time. He was living in Hollywood, Florida. And in fact, he had planned to return to Hollywood, Florida after the fight was over. So that's how he's in New York.
And as you began preliminarily investigating the case that arose out of this fight at MSG, what jumped out at you? What made you say, wow, we have something big here?
Probably the same thing that jumped out at people before it even came into my office. I think the headline of the New York Post the day after the fight, gosh, I can't remember what the actual headline said on the back page of the sports, but something like outrageous, because he ended up going to the hospital in a taxi cab. I mean, that really, really jumped out at anybody that looked at this fight and colored everybody's opinion of what happened that night all the way to the end, as it should have. It really, sending him to the hospital in a taxi cab was really outrageous, and that's the thing that stuck out from beginning to end. What happened afterwards, though, is as more investigation went on, it became more and more apparent as you dig into the details, and that's what attorneys do, try to reconstruct what happened. Minute by minute, second by second. And when you did that, the fact that he went to the hospital in a taxi cab, while that stuck out in the beginning and really was important throughout, that might not have been the worst thing that happened that night when you got into more of the details. Because what we found out was that the circumstances of him getting in the taxi was that he was instructed to get into a taxi or to take a taxi by the fight inspector. Now, that certainly was not the right advice, but at least it was somebody trying to do the right thing at the right time. The guy just wasn't trained to do so. He should have really been put in an ambulance, but at least the fight inspector at least tried to do the right thing at that point. What, let's say, a non-trained or a layperson might do and say, hey, you need to go to the hospital right away. Go get a cab, go right away. So that was kind of a situation where somebody tried to do the right thing and, wrong circumstances. But when we investigated the case with more detail, it was really, really painfully obvious that a lot more went wrong before the fight inspector ever was put in a very difficult position to say, hey, go to the hospital right now in a cab. The real screw-ups, the real problems happened way before that point.
So let's talk about that. So you sued New York State. What were the primary allegations? What were the main allegations? What did you allege they did wrong?
The lawsuits are a little bit complex because there's two lawsuits running at the same time. It would be strange for a layperson. It's probably strange even for a lawyer to hear, but you can only sue the state of New York in a special court called the Court of Claims, and you can't sue individuals that are not state employees in that court, so you have to sue them in Supreme Court. So you sort of have two cases going on at the same time surrounding the same event. The claims are a little bit different, but obviously overlap. So the claims against the state of New York were really about procedures and protocols. In other words, the things they had in place to protect these guys before the fight were inadequate. They weren't followed properly, and people weren't trained properly to follow them during the fight. And then the procedures and the policies that they had in place after the fight were just woeful as well, and left the fighter to his own means. So you sued the state of New York, or we sued the state of New York in the Court of Claims, and you're alleging negligence, not necessarily medical malpractice, because there was only one state of New York doctor. That was the chief medical officer, Barry Jordan, and he actually never laid hands on Mago. So you're suing everybody else involved in the state, which are really athletic commission employees, for the things they did or didn't do, and that has a lot to do with training, policies, procedures, and protocols, paperwork, and how they go about protecting these guys for their safety. At the same time, you have 4 independent contractor doctors, and MSG at one point was in the case, but they got out. Those guys are all sued in the Supreme Court in Kings County, and that case is actually still going on, and the allegations there are really medical malpractice. 3 of the physicians that laid hands on Mago departed from what we call accepted medical practice. In other words, they didn't do what other doctors would have done under the circumstances. So 2 different cases, 2 different claims, all arising out of the same set of circumstances.
And throughout the case, testimony came out that New York State officials failed to even follow their own procedures. How could any fighter feel safe walking into the ring under those circumstances in any case?
They shouldn't. They're treated horribly, the fighters. I mean, I don't think Mago's case is the first incident where it's come to light that boxers and MMA fighters aren't protected or treated properly. They're first of all not paid much at all, and then when they get in the ring, they have an expectation that policies and procedures are going to be in place to protect them, and they should. And certainly when you come into Madison Square Garden on this night, where you had 5 physicians dedicated only to the 2 boxers at a time, I don't know what boxer wouldn't think, okay, whatever happens to me in the ring, some things these guys can't protect me from, if I get punched in the head and get an injury like that, but I'm sure I'm going to be protected thereafter and get medical treatment thereafter. And they weren't. They really weren't. So if I was a boxer, even now after some of the reforms from this fight, I'd be pretty concerned getting in the ring that in addition to the normal risks that you're subjecting yourself to by getting in the ring, that you're really not getting the highest quality care from the people that are there just to do that. And those are state requirements, that these doctors be there, that they be trained, that they follow a certain set of protocols. And from what we can see, certainly in Mago's fight, it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. And that makes it even more dangerous than it already is.
Do you know if there are any other states or what other states do to protect fighters, either more or less? My understanding was always that New York State was always on the forefront of protecting fighters and imposing medical requirements. Do other states do it better?
Well, I mean, we didn't investigate each separate state and do comparisons, but from what I can tell, New York State endeavors to be at the forefront. They want to be at the forefront. They generate probably in the top 2 or 3 states in terms of money making from boxing. Probably Nevada being maybe the biggest, or Florida. So while New York generates a lot of money from boxing and now MMA, which was just legalized, which is really important to understand in the context of Mago's case, I don't think New York really has the best protection. From what I can understand, New Jersey, I think, is a lot more stringent. Massachusetts and even Nevada, their regulations seem to be a lot more stringent and adhered to a lot more strictly than what we see in New York. I don't know the reason why that happens, because I know that Governor Cuomo is a boxing fan and really want to legalize MMA and wants to be at the forefront of this kind of sport and the protections. And I know that's his desire to do that, and he certainly showed that desire through Mago's case and settling it and trying to issue reform, but it doesn't seem like it's being implemented. And that most likely is the problem with the New York State Athletic Commission, which Mago's fight really uncovered, really peeled back the onion of what was going on at the Athletic Commission and revealed, a commission that really just was in disarray. A lot of patronage, not a lot of high quality people at the time and training. And you really have to look no further than the fact that Melvina Latham, who was the commissioner at the time of Mago's fight, stepped down after Mago's fight. Now, she quit, or stepped aside. I think she probably would have been fired. The person that replaced her was an attorney named David Berlin, a very, very ethical attorney who also happened to be a boxing fan. He tried to implement more reforms and enforce policies that were already in place, be adhered to more, sort of clean it up. He ended up resigning about a year ago in the face of some of the requirements that were being passed by the state government in response to Mago's fight, and in the face of the fact that the Inspector General's report that happened, that was investigated after Mago's fight, hadn't been released. And his letter, he wrote a very public letter to the New York Post, the New York Times, with his resignation, and he laid all this stuff out. So, I think your question about, what New York State compared to other states, well, look at the activities both before and after Mago's fight, and you see that you have an athletic commission that's really not high caliber. And then that's the state governing body for the safety of these athletes. And even after Mago's fight, it's still not really in a position where you can say we're at the forefront of safety. You just can't. That's certainly my opinion, and I think that opinion is shared by a lot of other competent people.
And you mentioned the requirements that were put into place after the fight. The settlement number jumped out at everybody. It kind of caught everybody's eye. But other than that, the insurance requirements passed by the legislature. Can you talk about those a bit? Those seem to be what's affecting the boxing industry the most in light of Mago's case.
Yeah, the insurance requirements are affecting the boxing industry the most in a negative way. What happened was, and some of this is my opinion, but you can piece it together. MMA came to the legislative floor. New York State was the last state to legalize mixed martial arts. Shelley Silver, who obviously got himself in trouble, was a big opponent of it. And so I think once he sort of was out of the state legislature, and now it sort of clears the path for MMA to come in. And MMA obviously generates a lot of money. They have a lot of power behind them. New York is a huge market, so they want to legalize that. So that comes on the legislative floor. When it comes there, the Mago's lawsuit's going on, but the Inspector General's report somehow had not been released at that point, more than 2 years after the investigation was essentially complete. We started a separate lawsuit. We literally sued Paul Edelstein against the Inspector General for the state of New York, a separate lawsuit, compelling them to release the report. So we're literally suing the state saying, release this report. Where is this? Now, unbeknownst to us, I don't follow the legislature and what's going on. The legalization of MMA hit the legislative floor. So the 50-page Inspector General report that subsequently came out blasting the Athletic Commission had not been released. Had it been released, any opposition legislator that didn't want to legalize MMA or whatever would have just held up that 50-page report and said, how are we legalizing this sport when we have a 50-page report from an independent state agency that says it's not safe and the Athletic Commission is, totally screwed up? That report didn't exist. So when MMA hits the legislative floor, at least one state senator, I forget who it was, said, hey, well, what are we doing to protect these guys? And essentially they're talking about Mago's fight. So to appease him, they came up with this insurance requirement, and they essentially said, well, let's provide $1 million brain injury insurance policy in the event that somebody gets hurt. They didn't mention Mago by name, but the implication's clear, like Mago. And that sort of appeased people. Okay, well, all right, we're going to put this requirement in place, and that'll help, right? It'll insulate the state from liability, which I don't know how that helps Mago, because the taxpayers have paid $22 million to Mago. That's certainly a horrible result. It's something I don't like as a taxpayer, that I'm paying this bill. So the $1 million insurance requirement insulates the state at least for $1 million for that. And then it provides some measure of financial recovery for a boxer in the event he has a brain injury. How in the world that protects a boxer in the ring from safety, or an MMA fighter in the ring? You got me. It doesn't. It's a subsequent measure. it's a retrospective measure. In other words, now if you have an injury like Mago's, okay, there'll be an insurance policy in place of $1 million, which is really not a lot of money to cover somebody with an injury like Mago's anyway. So it doesn't do a thing to ensure safety before they get hurt. Nothing. But it was sort of a measure to put out there, and it kind of looked good. It's really sort of cosmetic. All right, well, we have this thing in place. Okay, and this one particular senator that was opposing it felt like it was a good thing. I don't blame them. Okay, we got something here. That's typically the way politics work. Okay, I'll vote for legalizing it. And I feel better now we have this insurance measure in place. The other byproduct of it, though, at least initially, was it's a new type of insurance. So insurance companies hadn't written it yet, and insurance companies are in the business of making money. So they have to decide, well, is this worth it? Do we want to write $1 million policy for a dangerous sport? Are we going to lose money on that? And how do we ensure we don't lose money? Well, we make sure the premiums on that policy are very high. So the immediate effect of passing that was that smaller fights, club fighting, which is really the bread and butter of these guys, of this industry, not the big fights. These guys have a hard time affording it, because the premiums are very high. So it tacks on a higher cost to the smaller matches, and it had the effect of really eliminating or severely reducing boxing matches across the state of New York and MMA matches across the state of New York because of this added financial burden, this added requirement. All right, now, since it's passed, I think there's more insurance carriers writing this policy. It's become a little more affordable, and so we're seeing people buy the policy. It's now a requirement. But it doesn't do a thing to help the safety of boxers, because it provides no added dissuasion for the doctors. It provides no rules and regulations to say, hey, this is when we've got to send a boxer into the hospital. We don't care. No financing or funding for whatever costs would be associated with getting a boxer some extra care, an X-ray, an MRI, a CT scan, a ride in an ambulance, which may have been on these guys' minds as to why they didn't want to send Mago in. So it really did nothing. So very much a cosmetic solution to appease certain people. Looks good on the outside. When you think about it without much detail, you realize it doesn't do a thing to help safety. Nothing.
And the fact that it's cosmetic and it falls on the shoulders of the promoters, who obviously, as you mentioned, can't stage these local fights, how ridiculous is that the boxers are the ones that are being hurt at the end?
You're 100% right. And the guys that are going to be affected like that are going to be the low-level guys. The guys that aren't making real big money. In fact, even Mago, and it was an undefeated fighter fighting in Madison Square Garden on that night at the undercard to the Gennady Golovkin fight. So he's sort of there, right? But many people are very surprised to hear that the purse for his fight that night was $40,000, and $10,000 went to his promoters and things like that. So, it's the low-level guys that would be even most affected by this new, let's call it a safety requirement, right? It's almost like and it definitely was a result of Mago's fight. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Well, what did that do? And in fact, David Berlin, who was the former commissioner of the Athletic Commission, fought back against that requirement, and that was really a primary reason why he decided to quit. And he said, "This is just outrageous. It's not a safety measure. It's going to hurt boxing rather than help it." And when you combine that with what I'm seeing going on in the Athletic Commission, this is sort of Berlin's own words, and the fact that an Inspector General report, in his opinion, and we agreed with him, was essentially being suppressed from being released for some reason, and the reason is obvious. It was held back until MMA got legalized. Berlin resigned, and said, "I'm not doing this." And here's a guy that was unbelievably qualified to do it. It's not a huge money-making job, for this guy. He can make more money doing other things, and now you have him out. So if that gives you any idea of the state of safety measures of the Athletic Commission or the state of the Athletic Commission, that's all you really need to know. And it's a shame, since we're obviously the leading state in so many different ways, and we have a governor who really wants to be a champion of these things, probably has presidential aspirations, which is great. Certainly stepped up and did the right thing in settling Mago's case. I really applaud him for that. I'm a litigator for 25 years, and I got to say, this is a situation where the governor's office with the attorney general made it very clear to us fairly early on in the litigation that they wanted to talk, that they wanted to get this resolved fairly, and they did. So on the one hand, you have an administration doing the right thing in the myopic world of this case, and in the larger picture of safety of the sport and generating income for the state, because that's really what it's all about, really, really not doing things in a way that provides safety for these guys. And that's a shame.
And how practical do you think federal legislation being passed could address these issues? That seems to be something that could help more than anything else, because you'd have a uniform policy among most states.
I think it would help. I think it's important to do that. You have the Muhammad Ali Act that was passed federally, but that really dealt with financial protections of these fighters who were just being, abused financially. So it put a lot of measures in protection there. I think unification federally is an excellent way to try to make this happen, but it's cumbersome, and you have to convince now the federal government to get involved in something that typically would be left to the states. But that's a very big problem that the boxing world and MMA world has now. It's a Wild West show. All states are different, and that lends itself to bigger problems, sort of which you could look, let's say, licensing, where some guy maybe wouldn't get permission to fight in one state because of a medical issue, and then okay, I'll just go over here. I'll just go to Connecticut and they'll license me. Someone that's more lax. So you have that going on, and that breeds, unfortunately, danger for these guys from a safety perspective. So federal legislation would definitely change that, sure. And you have one of the greatest guys in there, one of the greatest congressmen in there, McCain, John McCain, who is a big champion of this stuff. He proposed federal legislation years ago. But I guess, listen, I can understand the federal government maybe feels like, look, they have other things that they need to deal with other than boxing and the sport. But it would seem to be an easier solution if you mandated some uniform regulations federal-wise, and then the states had to comply with it.
How helpful would maybe headgear or some other protective equipment be to shield fighters from this sort of trauma? And how do you balance that with... I didn't know anything about boxing, other than as a casual observer before this case. Now I have some expertise in it, but I definitely can't say that I'm an expert in the impact of headgear and the size of the gloves and things like that. But my understanding is that headgear may not protect the brain injury at all, and may actually even, and in some instances, add to it, exacerbate it to some degree, which is strange. It does provide a measure of protection for your face, your jaws, fractures, and things like that. And then obviously on the flip side, it may diminish the entertainment value. People want to see knockouts. I just think that that's been talked about a long time in boxing, what you're going to do with headgear. And it's a debate that's probably never going to result in headgear being used at the professional level. You're getting into a greater debate about the efficacy of boxing in general, and if you had to ask me as a personal injury lawyer, having the knowledge that I do about brain injury, forget about headgear. You just shouldn't really be stepping in a ring, taking any punches to your head with what I understand about brain injury. So, that it's just a different question. I don't think you're going to ever see headgear become a mandated part of professional boxing. I doubt it. Now, how's Mago's recovery going? What's the anticipated course of action? How well is he going to recover? How long will it take? What's the impact that this will have on his life in the coming years?
Well, I think that Mago, it's really tragic to think that I could say in the same sentence, I think he's made a miraculous recovery. And at the same time, he's never, in my opinion, from what I understand, he's never going to walk again, and he's never going to communicate again effectively. And he's never going to be able to use one side of his body with any real ability. So think about that. A miraculous recovery from where he was, only to be left in probably the worst type of situation medically I think you could be in. And that is hemiparesis, so he's half paralyzed and not able to walk and use one side of his body, and locked in. And locked in the sense that he probably has a pretty good idea of what's going on around him and, who everybody is and who he was. There's no way for us to know for sure, but my belief is, and from the medicals, he really has a good understanding of things that are going on around him, but unable to communicate with any kind of significant ability. He cannot really put sentences together, and he couldn't pick up a pen and, sort of write out a whole sentence to you and say how he felt. So it's really a kind of a locked-in syndrome. Horrible. So it's horrible. The future is probably just much of the same. When you're 3, coming on 4 years. Yeah, I mean, he's just about coming on 4 years now. Wow, it's almost 4 years to the day. I think it's November 3rd was the fight in 2013. So when you're about 4 years out of a severe neurological injury like this, you're basically that static. There's not much more that can be done for you or improvement that's going to happen for you. So while he's been brought to this incredible level of recovery, and that's really mostly due to his wife and the caretakers that are around him, the people that are around him, and the medical treatment that he's received, in large part because he had a lawsuit going. I mean, that's a big byproduct of him being able to get treated the way he was, is because he had a lawsuit, so he had us in place to help with that and help secure financing for that. Otherwise, he wouldn't get this treatment. So all of those things, chiefly really his wife, helped him recover to the point that he is, which really is like miraculous. Like, I don't think in the beginning, I never thought he would have been as good as he is right now, but yet look where he is. He's in a situation that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, right now. So, and that reflects on the large number of the settlement, the $22 million offer from the state, which is only part of the value of the case. We have another portion of the case that we're aggressively pursuing. The case is worth more, but they paid a large amount of money in reflection of the tragic state that the guy's in. You just don't see that too often. A $22 million settlement in the personal injury world is extraordinarily rare. That the public may not think so. The general people may think, everybody sues for millions and millions and this and that. That's not reality. That's not what happens. Even when juries give awards that you may hear in the paper, $50 million for this and that and this, they get reduced. Appellate courts knock them down. There is a rational basis for these awards. You just don't see this kind of number too often. It was absolutely appropriate in this case. It's probably 2/3 of the true value of what the poor guy's injuries are, what I think the value is, and that's reflective of how horrible a situation he's in medically. It couldn't be worse. That's why you saw this kind of number.
And now I know you've taken this case, you made it into a project, and you've advocated for something called Mago's Law. What is that?
Well, we just think that the existing laws that are on the books at the New York State Athletic Commission could be streamlined a little bit. They're gray. It's a gray zone. In other words, how do you deal with a potential neurological injury? And in this case, the physicians defended the case by saying, listen, we don't agree with their testimony. We think the evidence is the opposite. But essentially, they're saying, hey, look, even though he looked like he got the hell beat out of him, so what? We didn't see any neurological signs and symptoms when we examined him. Now, let's put aside for the moment that I think they're wrong. I think those signs and symptoms were there. But even in that situation, they're essentially saying, because we didn't see that, we cleared him neurologically. And that's ridiculous, because there's only two ways to really clear somebody neurologically from having a brain bleed like Mago had. He had a slow subdural hematoma that will kill you if it's left untreated, all right? Or severely damage you like it did here. The one way to rule it out completely is to take a CT scan. You take a CT scan, you're going to see it. And if it's there, you're going to be able to deal with it. And the tragic thing with Mago's case is that had they seen this thing, they could have dealt with it, and Mago would be having this conversation with you instead of me. That's how easily it could have been really cured. So a CT scan. But, of course, the physicians in the athletic commission and the promoters are saying, well, we can't just send every guy to the hospital and give everybody a CT scan. Now, my position is, hey, yes, you can if you want to. It's just money, as opposed to a guy's life. And you want to pay us $22 million in a lawsuit, you could spread that money out and give everybody a CT scan. So that is possible. Okay, but short of that, if you don't want to scan everybody, if you don't want to give everybody a diagnostic test, if you just treat them like an emergency room patient after a fight, which is what they really are, they're suffering horrible trauma that any normal doctor would say, go to the hospital. The two ways to deal with it are either diagnostic tests or observation for a sufficient period of time to allow the neurological signs and symptoms to manifest themselves. So there's something in medicine sort of called the golden hour, and basically it stands for the proposition that if you have a trauma, it's that first hour is usually crucial, and almost everything can be dealt with during that first hour if you get to it. So a boxer is suffering a severe trauma. Even if they just take one punch to the head, that's enough to kill you. You need to let at least that hour go by. We think that's a minimal amount of time. before you clear a guy and say, okay, you're in the clear. So again, going back to try to make it simple, two ways to clear them. Either you scan them, you give them a diagnostic test, which I understand is impractical at an arena, or you let a sufficient amount of time pass whereby you examine him again and say, okay, it's been an hour. You're still not showing any neurological signs, vomiting, dizziness, nausea, your pupils dilating, your speech being off, your balance being off, headache. None of those things are there. After an hour, I'm comfortable sending you home. But if the symptoms change, do this, that, the other thing. That's what would happen if you went into an emergency room. So you either do one of two things. You either send them in right away and you go, we don't even care what you say. And that's what should happen to Mago. You go to the ER. What's the difference? Sit there. Okay? Or if you're not going to send them in right away, you at least do enough of these serial assessments, these repeat neurological assessments over a sufficient period of time whereby you could be comfortable saying, okay, you're fine. At least at this point, you can go home. But if the situation changes, get yourself back in. It's not that complicated. And in Mago's case, the real tragedy is we know for a fact that the last time any doctor looked at him was 22 minutes, at a maximum, 22 minutes after the end of the fight. That's not enough time. They never looked at him again. You're fine. You can't clear somebody in 22 minutes. You can't. Unless you've taken a CT scan. Then you can. So, I mean, it's just so simple. So, it's a very long answer, but if you want to really capsulize it, and we put it out to the media somewhere, you just do that. You just say, listen, Mago's law, here's what it's going to be. Guy takes one punch to the head. One, that's enough. In order to clear him neurologically, you have to do one of two things. Either you're sending him to the emergency room, and then they can deal with him. Or if you're not sending him to the emergency room, you're examining him neurologically over a period of time, and we say an hour, use that golden hour of a barometer, whereby you can competently say, I'm ruling out a neurological injury at this time. You can now go home. If that happened in Mago's case, he's sitting here having this conversation with you, not me. Doesn't sound that complicated, does it?
And thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. Where could people go to learn more about Mago, about his case, and about what people can do to help athletes in Mago's position?
I guess right now, there's a lot of stuff up on our website. And when if you Google us or you Google Mago's name and the articles that have come out in his case, you could probably find a lot of stuff. We're trying to sort of capsulize and capitalize on what happened to Mago to try to get a little momentum for a little impetus for passing these laws or streamlining these laws. We're trying to do it, to get the word out. There's only so much you can do as one attorney, but the real wonderful thing about being a personal injury attorney and a small guy, I mean, we're one little firm, right? Is these civil cases can effectuate social change. They are a mechanism for getting things done and changing things. Be it a boxing match or any other safety regulation. There are a mechanism for doing that. So, information can be gleaned by looking at Mago's case, and all of Mago's information is publicly available on the court's computers. You can access everything that we've said and all the detail and all the deposition testimony and expert reports and inspector general report. It's all out there in the Supreme Court of Kings County. They're all scanned in and computerized. The courts have finally moved into the 21st century. And you can go on a site called eLaw and look up Mago's case, and just from your computer screen, read it all. And be a judge for yourself, and raise a ruckus for yourself, guys that are, there's a lot of people out there that love this sport, that really champion this sport. I was shocked to see, because I didn't know, much about boxing in the beginning, how many people just really, really care for this sport, to get out there and do something and try to improve it and make it better. And, that ability is out there. So if there are more people out there that care about this sport and the guys that are in it, champion the safety aspect of it so it continues. Otherwise, there's a huge segment of the population that obviously are going to say this is crazy and just eliminate the sport altogether if you can't make it safe. And groundswell will only grow when people realize that the taxpayers of the state of New York pay $22 million to a boxer like this for a complete screw up like this. And I'm with them. I'm one of the taxpayers. That shouldn't happen. So if you can't improve the safety of this and get it out there, you're gonna have more of these cases, more of these tragic situations. There's another one in Virginia right now, a fighter named Pritchard Colon, who was hurt like Mago and shouldn't have been, and there's a lawsuit going there. That's what's going to happen until somebody gets a hold of the safety aspect of it and says, now we've done everything to prevent this from happening again. You know, the one thing you can't prevent, we totally understand it. The guy gets hit in the head horribly in the ring and dies on the spot. That's a risk that these guys take. They all know it. But they don't take the risk that somebody's going to fail them after the fight. It's very much like swimmers in a pool is the way we equated it. You know, my kids jump in a pool and they don't swim that well. They're assuming the risk they may drown in that pool, right? That's okay. But they don't assume the risk that when they get out of the pool, the 3 lifeguards are going to screw up and let them drown. You know, and that's what happened in this case. There were 4 lifeguards in a pool with only 2 swimmers, and one of them drowned. And that should not happen. It just should not happen. So that's where we're at.
And you mentioned you're just one little firm, but you're doing big things. Where could people go to learn more about your firm and what you guys do?
I guess my website, the Edelstein, Fagenberg, and Brown. You know, if we're going to pitch us, I guess this is an opportunity to do it. We don't really advertise. We don't really do that. You know, we're a boutique firm. We're extremely competent and good at what we do. Mago's case is a pretty good example of it. It's not the only case that we've had this kind of success on. If anybody wants more information about his case or what we're able to do, they just go to our website, call us up, find us. We're easy to find. I've been in business a long time. My father was an attorney. My grandfather was an attorney. You know, we know what to do. We know how to do it. We really care about these things. I think a lot of other lawyers, I was surprised when Mago's case settled, or the part of it settled, to hear from a lot of other lawyers out there, you know, that see it in the law journal, and these things get out and around. And the response from a lot of other attorneys was, wow, I wouldn't have even taken that case, which is, we never felt that way. But a lot of lawyers looked at it and said, wow, that was a tough case. I mean, to take a boxer with all the assumption of the risk and do what you guys did on it. A lot of lawyers looked at it and said, wow, I wouldn't have even tried that. So that was a surprise to us. We never felt that way. Maybe we're a little crazy, I guess, but we've been that way since the beginning, and we'll never change.
Well, in this business, being a bit crazy may be a bit good. Paul, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Very much appreciated once again.
Anytime. I appreciate it. Thanks so much for having me. Good luck with everything, and I'm glad people are reporting on it. I hope people understand what happened and try to do something about it. That's the beauty of our civil justice system, you know, and the beauty of our journalistic system, which is just as, maybe even more important. In fact, the two of them together are the biggest checks on government or corporations that could possibly exist. The judicial system and personal injury lawyers and civil lawyers, most important thing. Perfect balance.
Paul, thanks so much once again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that's our interview with attorney Paul Edelstein. Hope you had a good time. Thanks so much for listening. My name is Dmitriy Shakhnevich, and if you want to learn more about me, please visit www.dshacklaw.com. And this is the Fight Lawyer Podcast. Till next time, folks.